News of the Times. Sisters, Poison and Betrayal. The Forfar murder case of 1827. Welcome to News of the Times. In 1827, the quiet Scottish town of Forfar was shaken by a case of betrayal within a family. Two sisters, Margaret and Jane Wishart, lived together in a crowded boarding house, but their lives were overshadowed by scandal, secrecy, and whispered affairs. Jane, blind and dependent on her elder sister, gave birth to the child of Andrew Loy, a man accused of cruelty and suspected of carrying on secretly with her sister Margaret. When Jane and her newborn infant suddenly felt gravely ill, suspicion turned to the very person meant to protect them, her own sister. Was Margaret Wishart guilty of poisoning her blind sister and newborn nephew with arsenic? Or was this tragedy the result of shame, misfortune, and rumour? With no proof of purchase and only circumstantial evidence, the courtroom drama that followed would expose family secrets, desperate lies, and the darkest suspicions of betrayal. Join us as we uncover the twists of the Forfar poisoning case of 1827, a story of sisters, scandal, and the ultimate question of guilt. And in today's end of episode Further Particulars segment, we meet the charming Miss Matilda Cronin, who decided to liven up Dudley Street with a midnight serenade for her old flame, George Marsh. The ballad consisted mostly of insults, followed by a swift right hook to his jaw, a spirited chase through the streets, and a window-smashing encore. Their romance, it seemed, is now strictly pay per pain. Before we begin, do give us a like, a subscribe, and share us with your local window pane repairman. It helps us stay in one piece and keeps the YouTube algorithm from throwing stones. Now, with the panes patched and the algorithm appeased, let's peer through the murky glass of history and see what scandal lies within. Background. Sisters Jane and Margaret Wishart were two sisters residing in the Scottish town of Forfar in 1827. Margaret, the elder, acted as Jane's caretaker, for Jane had been blind from birth and relied heavily upon her sister in daily life. Despite her disability, Jane was industrious and contributed to her own upkeep by working as a weaver. The sisters lived together in a crowded boarding house in Forfar, where they shared lodgings with other families and tenants. Within this household arrangement, Margaret was known to take the lead in domestic matters. She prepared meals, tended the cooking, and maintained the household, while also assisting Jane in matters that she could not perform unaided. Their circumstances were modest, and Jane's blindness, coupled with Margaret's responsibilities as both provider and guardian, shaped much of their existence. Testimony at the trial revealed that their relationship was close, but also bound by necessity. Jane's dependence upon Margaret for movement, meals, and general care was absolute, while her weaving allowed her to retain some measure of financial contribution. At the end of the events that led to the trial, both sisters were living under one roof with others in Forfar. Their lives intertwined not only by family ties, but by the practical reality of Jane's condition and Margaret's role as caretaker. When Margaret Wishart stood accused of poisoning her sister and her sister's child, the Perthshire Courier reported the case in exhaustive detail. The courtroom was crowded, anticipation running high. Witness after witness was called, painting a picture of suspicion, betrayal, and arsenic. From the Perthshire Courier, the 19th of April, 1827, the trial of Margaret Wishart for poisoning her sister and child. The court, at about 1 o'clock, proceeded to the following trial, which was excited in the most intense interest, both from its atrocious nature and its fatal result. Margaret Wishart, accused of murder by having administered a quantity of arsenic to her sister Jane Wishart, residing with her in Arbroath on the 3rd, 4th, 5th and 6th days of October in 1826, of which poison was mixed up with a quantity of porridge or gruel and given to her to eat, and also to an infant male child, of which the said Jane Wishart had been delivered upon the said 6th of October, in consequence of which the poisonous mixture, the said Jane Wishart immediately thereafter became violently ill, and lingered in great pain until the 8th day of the said month, when she died. And the said child also became ill and lingered in great pain until the 9th day of October, when it also died in consequence thereof. Such was the substance of the indictment, to which the accused Margaret Wishart pleaded not guilty. The charge was clear enough. Margaret stood accused of lacing her sister's porridge with arsenic, causing the death of both Jane and her newborn. The first witness brought forward is David Edwards, who had lived in the lodging house with the two sisters. Dave Edwards, witness. Dave Edwards lodged in the accused's house in October last, where her sister Jane also lived and who died in that month. Jane was blind, and the witness never saw her preparing victuals. He remembers Jane was unwell before her death. He was in the habit of calling at the women's room in the evening and took his meals there. Jane complained of being unwell on Tuesday morning in consequence of eating some porridge she had got from the milk boy. The pain was in her lower bowels. He did not see her vomit on that evening, nor whisky or anything else taken to relieve the pain. He thinks on Thursday evening she complained of a sore head, in addition to the pain in the bowels. He did not see her at all on Friday, but when he came home to dinner, he was told she had been delivered of a child. He never saw her again in life. Edwards continued, the deceased Jane Wishart had told him Andrew Roy, a former lodger, was the father of the child of which she had now been delivered. He was requested to sit up all night on account of her illness, and the accused, Margaret Wishart, sat along with him. The deceased complained of thirst and got toast and water occasionally in the course of the night from her sister in a small stone mug. Witness went to bed at about daylight in the morning, but did not see the deceased. He heard her vomiting during the night frequently. He saw the child and had it on his knee for the most part of the night. He stated never saw any sign of ill will between the sisters. He states that the accused, Margaret Wishart, was very attentive to her sister during her illness, and she sometimes toasted the bread for the toast water and assisted in preparing it. He continued, Margaret Wishart, the accused, was much surprised when she first discovered her sister's pregnancy. She did not speak in much anger about the occurrence, but said it would be a great affront to them. Nevertheless, she would do the best she could to support the child, and were the mother to die, the babe would be given out, and she would contribute what she could for its support. On Edwards being asked whether the accused seemed to think her sister was going to die, the witness appeared either embarrassed or unwell, and did not answer the question. The next witness, Catherine Greig, was acquainted both with the accused and her deceased sister Jane, who lived together. She was in their house, the sisters Wishart, on the previous Tuesday evening before Jane's death. Porridge was given to Jane at that time, but she did not know whether the accused was taking any, nor did she know who made the porridge. She was about half an hour in the house, during which time Jane was taken ill, and said she had wished she had taken no supper that night, as she thought it had done her ill. About 11 o'clock, the accused was standing at the fireside and said, "Oh, there is another child in the way." Witness asked when she was delivered, and accused answered she was delivered. The accused, Margaret Wishart, asked witness to go in and see her, which she did, and Jane said she was dying. She could not tell what was the matter, she was so ill. Jane stated that she would submit to the will of the Almighty, either to die or to live, but she would rather die. Witness next proposed to send for a doctor to the child, who was also ill, but the accused, Margaret Wishart, said she did not know the use of that, for what could a doctor say about a child, as he could not know its complaint? The child seemed to suffer under the same complaint as the mother, and on Saturday after dinner time the witness went in again, when the deceased again said she was dying. The deceased said to the accused, "Oh, Meggie, be good to my baby." So far as the witness ever observed, the accused and her sister always lived on good terms. The testimony of Edwards and Catherine Greig painted a picture of a household where, despite Jane's suffering, her sister Margaret appeared outwardly attentive and dutiful, preparing toast, water, watching through the night, and even speaking of supporting the child if tragedy struck. Yet cracks emerged. His hesitation when asked if Margaret seemed to think her sister would die left the court with an uneasy silence. It was now left to the next witness, Jessie Smith, to shed further light on the sisters' final days together. Jessie Smith, or Mackenzie, lived near the accused and her sister. The accused came to her on a Friday and asked her to come up and see her sister. Witness brought Mrs. Payne, a midwife, with her. She returned again in the evening when the deceased was very poorly and complained of a particularly bad draught. The next morning she was again called, and when the accused, Margaret Wishart, said her sister had been very ill and that she thought she was dying, she assisted in removing Jane to another bed. Her extremities were then cold and stiff. The child was poorly also, having been taken ill in the course of the night. The accused said she had given it some gruel. Witness took the child, whose belly was swelled quite hard. She took off its clothes, put them on again, and gave it some sugar and water to drink. The deceased wished to have Dr. Clark. When the accused, Margaret Wishart, replied, "I wondered to hear you, for Dr. Clark, not all doctors in Arbroath can do you any good." No doctor was sent for, and the deceased always complained of a great thirst. Witness gave her drink repeatedly herself. She noticed a dish at Jane's bedside, which she thought was toast and water. This was always vomited. The deceased complained of no particular pain, but was quite uneasy and had no peace to lie. She died on the night between Saturday and Sunday. The accused, Margaret Wishart, told her that the deceased had asked her to keep the child, which she did not consent to, and on Sunday she saw the child very ill, and it died on Monday morning. She returned about 10 o'clock forenoon and found deceased in the same state. He recommended that Dr. Clark should be sent for, which the accused objected to, saying that everything had been done that could be done, and a doctor could do her no good, and she was not able to pay a doctor's charge. The witness then ordered another doctor to be sent for, but this the accused also resisted. In the afternoon, she endeavoured to relieve the patient by repeated warm fomentations, but without effect. She did not see her alive after that. On Monday, she saw both mother and child put into a coffin. The child at its birth appeared healthy, but on Saturday morning the accused said she did not think the child well, as it had moaned all night. The child continued to worsen and worsen till death, and witness continued to visit the child repeatedly till that time. His belly was swollen, but the matter which Jane vomited did not strike her as of any particular appearance. Her symptoms were different from those common to women after childbirth. During the time of her labour, witness perceived no unusual symptoms. Afterwards, the deceased, Jane Wishart, was seized with a violent coldness along with other symptoms. Up to this point, the court had heard much about the domestic life inside the Wishart household, illness, care, and the uneasy signs of neglect. But another strand of evidence began to emerge, drawing attention away from the sick room and towards the darker influence of Andrew Roy, a former lodger. Questions now arose not only about his abuse of Jane, but also about the nature of his connection with Margaret herself. Charlotte Prophet lived in the same house with the accused and her sister, who had come there some months before Jane's death. They kept boarders, and when they first arrived, there were 4, among whom was Andrew Roy. The deceased Jane Wishart sometimes complained of ill treatment. She was often heard weeping, although the reason was never explained. At times her sister did not seem to be in the best understanding, but the witness never heard any specific cause assigned. The deceased sometimes hinted that there was a bad life between her sister and Andrew Roy, although she never said on what account. Witness had seen both the accused, Margaret Wishart, and Roy go out at night, not together, but within a little of one another, and then return in the same manner. This might have happened not less than twice a week for some time. The deceased was quite blind and younger than the accused. Mary Greig deposed that Jane Wishart had lived with her for some time, but left her more than 3 years before. Before that time, she had had a child, which she told witness was by Andrew Roy. She begged the witness not to reveal it, as she herself had been sworn by Margaret and Andrew Roy not to disclose it. About 6 months before her death, the witness saw the deceased in Applegate. Jane asked why witness never came to see her. The deceased wished her to take a house and live with her, for she was ill-used by Andrew Roy, who struck and abused her until she complained with his ways. If the evidence of abuse and suspicion had already painted Margaret Wishart in a troubling light, what followed struck a jury as something far more deliberate. From her cell in Arbroath jail, Margaret sought to reshape the narrative. She summoned Catherine Greig and pressed her to invent a story that Jane herself had gone to buy poison, hinting at thoughts of self-destruction. It was a calculated attempt to deflect blame, suggesting suicide rather than murder by Margaret's hand. Witness saw the accused, Margaret Wishart, in jail at Arbroath about 2 months ago, having been sent for by her. The accused took her into an empty room in the jail and urged her to say that witness had gone with the deceased to Dr. Croyle's shop to buy poison. Witness answered that she could not say so, for it wasn't true. The accused said she did not think there was any harm in telling a lie that was to do someone good. Witness never went with the deceased to any shop to buy poison. Nancy McPherson was the person who brought the message for her to come to the jail, and she complied only after a second message by the same person. Neighbours and townsfolk had begun to notice Margaret's strange manner in those final hours. One recalled her looking canny and condemned-like, as if surprised in a bad act. When the infant cried, she said its mother was not able to own the child, and she was giving it a drink, and it was terrible things that this and Jane had not cried again. The neighbour urged kindness towards a poor blind creature. Margaret answered that she had much to do with her, but she did not think she would live long now, using harsh expressions and showing no sorrow. Mrs. Sharp, a midwife, was called on the Sunday after the birth. She found the child very ill and recommended a doctor be sent for. The accused opposed this, as she was not able to pay for one. The midwife went regardless and brought Dr. Finlay, who saw the child repeatedly vomit and noted the belly was distended. He later observed that Margaret showed no particular anxiety about the child, although she told him to do anything for it. When he desired to look at the body of the dead, the accused declined. The medical evidence. Suspicion now pressed into the churchyard of St. Vigians, where Dr. Arrott and colleagues, Palmer and Shapey, disinterred the body of Jane Wishart and a male child and carried them to the schoolhouse. After examination, the stomach and certain parts of the intestines were taken out. The stomach was divided in two. One half was retained and the other sent in a sealed bottle by the mail coach to Dr. Christiansen, a professor of medical jurisprudence at Edinburgh. The doctor had no hesitation that the deceased died in consequence of arsenic having been administered, and that an earlier period than Friday before her death. From the appearances and from the evidence he had heard that day, it was of his opinion the arsenic had been administered on Tuesday. He found 1/4 part of a grain of arsenic in the stomach after subjecting it to the usual tests. The prisoner's own declarations were then read, but they proved hazy at best. A confused tale of potatoes at supper, a sudden illness, and Jane briefly recovering to spin before the pains of childbirth returned. Nothing conclusive could be drawn from them. One of the earliest witnesses was even clapped into irons for perjury, a distracting sideshow that left the jury little the wiser. With the witnesses dismissed, it was now time for counsel to address the jury. First, the Crown, determined to secure a conviction, and then the defence, pleading for the accused's life. Mr. Dundas said he did not consider it necessary to detain the jury by stating any arguments in support of the fact having been established that the deceased and her child had come by their death by means of arsenic, that he was convinced his learned brother on the other side would not attempt to deny. He had only therefore to come to the question, by whom was the poison administered? Certainly by someone else than the deceased Jane Wishart herself, for it had been proven that, being blind, she was obliged to depend upon the good offices of some other one else for the preparing of her victuals, and that these were always prepared by her sister. The learned gentleman recapitulated various points of the evidence against the accused, Margaret Wishart. Her expressions of displeasure towards her sister, which had been deposed to by several of the witnesses, the variance of some points of her declaration with the evidence adduced, the urging of Mary Greig to tell a lie for her preservation, he concluded by craving a verdict of guilty. The Honourable Mr. Melville rose for the defence. A heavy and a painful duty to him, a young man but lately coming to the bar. He would depend, he said, on the intelligence and good sense of an independent jury. On the child he urged the jury to acquit. He had not appeared from the medical report and evidence that the child had died of poison. Turning to the greater charge, he argued the onus propandi lay with the Crown, not the prisoner. He reminded the court that the sisters generally lived on amicable terms, and that even when the deceased did not live under the prisoner's roof, she cooked her victuals and carried them for her, and shewed for her every attention her destitute situation required. Then the absence of proof. Was there any proof that the accused had ever purchased poison or had any in her possession? No attempt had been at any time made to establish this point by the prosecution. As for the much discussed gruel, it had been made at the request of the midwife, and what remained was not huddled out of the way. It remained open to the inspection of all. On the question of doctors, he said that Margaret's refusal came after the extremities of the deceased were deadly cold, when help was futile. Besides, a regular midwife attended her, brought through a neighbour, not by Margaret. In closing, after a great deal many more able arguments, he craved a verdict, if not of not guilty, at least not proven. The Lord Justice Clerk's address to the jury lasted upwards of 2 hours. His lordship concluded by expressing his fears that the jury could not, consistently with their duty and their oaths, find any other verdict than that of guilty. The jury retired, and after an absence of about half an hour returned with a verdict, finding by a plurality of voices the accused guilty of the murder of her sister as libelled, but unanimously finding the charge, so far as it related to the murder of the child, not proven. The prisoner was then sentenced to be hanged at Forfar on Saturday the 2nd day of June next, between the hours of 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and her body to be delivered over to Dr. Munro, Professor of Anatomy in Edinburgh, to be publicly dissected and anatomized. The accused received her awful doom without betraying much emotion. The trial lasted 13 hours. With the testimony concluded and the verdict returned, the case of Margaret Wishart passed from the courtroom into history. Yet, as so often in trials resting on circumstantial evidence, doubts linger. Her guilt was pronounced in law, but in public opinion the matter was less certain. What followed at Forfar would be remembered not only as a punishment for a dreadful crime, but also a spectacle that drew thousands to witness the final hours of a woman who went to the scaffold, still protesting her innocence. From the Aberdeen Press and Journal, the 27th of June, 1827, Margaret Wishart, who was convicted at the Perth Circuit in April of poisoning her blind sister, then pregnant, was executed at Forfar on Saturday the 16th inst. The atrocious nature of the crime and the punishment attached to it were sufficient to attract the public attention in no common degree, but an additional interest was created by the circumstance that, while she all along asserted her innocence, many were of the opinion that the evidence, which was altogether circumstantial, was far from conclusive. A petition to the King for mercy was forwarded from Perth, and assurances were given to her by those who interested themselves in her fate, and that there were grounds to hope her doom might be mitigated. When she arrived at Forfar, she entertained the most sanguine expectations of mercy, and these expectations were fostered by well-meant but injudicious communications which she subsequently received. A relation who visited her having spoken decidedly as to the groundlessness of these hopes, she became sullen and thoughtful, and she was troubled with dreams, and her imagination presented to her visions of her sister and her child. It was not until within 8 days of the time fixed for her execution that she began seriously to prepare for death, and even during this period her mind was haunted with projects of self-destruction, which she finally overcame and sincerely repented of. She evinced the greatest self-control, and indeed never lost her composure of mind, except for an instant when it was communicated to her that her arms must be pinioned. The unhappy woman was now brought from her cell, and as she passed the door of an adjoining cell, she shook hands with its inmates and warned them to repent. As she shook hands with the magistrates and ministers, and after thanking them warmly for their attentions, intimated that she was ready to proceed to the scaffold. The Reverend Mr. Glugston now begged her as a dying woman to say whether she was guilty or not. She answered, "I am not guilty, and God will plead my cause." She then stepped onto the platform leaning on Mr. Glugston and preceded by the magistrates. She was now for the first time presented to the view of the assembled multitude. She was neatly dressed in black with a white apron. She appeared to be about 40 years of age. At the scaffold she was seated in a chair and opened her psalm book, which she held with a steady hand. The 5th hymn was sung in a very affecting manner, and Mr. Glugston offered up a most powerful prayer. The white cap covered her face, the fatal noose surrounded her neck, and the handkerchief with which she was given the signal was in her hand. She was placed on the drop, and in this situation she remained for 25 minutes engaged in prayer. In this last appeal to the Almighty, she confessed herself a great sinner and worthy of death, but asserted her innocence of the crime for which she suffered. She shifted the handkerchief from one hand to the other and again began to pray, and at length it was necessary to inform her that the time fixed by the sentence was fast expiring. She faintly answered, "A few minutes yet," and after a solemn pause, lifting up her face to heaven, she gave the signal. The drop fell with a harsh and rumbling sound, and in a few minutes, after one or two convulsive motions, she was a lifeless corpse. The drop fell at 18 minutes past 3 o'clock. The body was cut down at 4, put into a box, and sent off to Edinburgh to be delivered to Dr. Munro for dissection. It is supposed the number of spectators was betwixt 4,000 and 5,000. It is 44 years since an execution took place in Forfar. Further particulars. Romance. It begins with roses, moonlit whispers, and the occasional stolen kiss, and sometimes ends with a midnight serenade, a bruised cheek, and several smashed windows. Such was the case of Miss Matilda Cronin, who decided that if love could not conquer all, it could at least conquer the glasswork at number 14 Dudley Street in Paddington. Mr. George Marsh, peacefully embraced by Morpheus, no doubt dreaming of more tranquil days, was rudely summoned back to reality by Matilda's dulcet tones, urging him to come down and have his nerves astonished. What followed was less Romeo and Juliet and more Punch and Judy. By morning's light, George was out an ear's worth of peace, a pane or two of glass, and worst of all, his dignity. Matilda, meanwhile, was out the price of repairs and any lingering pretence that theirs had been a most affectionate connection. From the Morning Post, the 1st of January 1849, Marylebone, an invocation. On Saturday, Matilda Cronin, an Irish girl, was charged by a Mr. George Marsh, a resident at number 14 Dudley Street in Paddington, under the following circumstances. Mr. Marsh stated that he was asleep in his bed when he was aroused from the arms of Morpheus by a serenade, the burthen of which was something in the following style. He got out of bed, opened the door, and there, to his astonishment, beheld the lovely Matilda, who bestowed upon his sinister cheek a blow that gave him a singing in his ear ever since. Maria bolted. He pursued. She doubled and got to his domicile before him. Upon his arrival there, he found her pursuing the active occupation of smashing his windows. He gave her into custody for so doing, and on being cross-questioned, he admitted that he and Miss Cronin had lived upon the most affectionate terms, but he said that was a long time ago. Defendant was ordered to pay for all the damage that she had done. Come down, you scurvy George Marsh, and I'll tell you something that will astonish your weak nerves, and no mistake. Well, if you've enjoyed the entire performance, you are either possessed of heroic fortitude or simply too polite to leave early. Should you have found the proceedings dreary, fret not. The poor scriptwriter has already been packed off to a remote parish with only a quill and a single stale bath bun for company. But if by some miracle amusement has been yours, then permit us a modest request. Lend us your favour by striking that mystical like, subscribing with all the solemnity of a parish oath, and dispatching this missive forthwith to acquaintances, adversaries, and any passing highwayman with a Wi-Fi connection. Know this: each click appeases the capricious spirit of YouTube and secures us the continued supply of tea, biscuits, and dangerously misleading reference books. Go on then, be splendid, be positively Georgian. And for those rare souls of superhuman fortitude who wish to indulge our endeavours even further, do consider joining our Patreon. Within its hallowed vaults lie hundreds of long-form documentaries charting Georgian murders, Victorian scandals, and Edwardian nostalgia, peculiar corners of British history, and the occasional ill-advised attempt at Edwardian humour. New episodes appear daily, so you'll never be short of grim curiosities or eccentric tales. And just think, for the price of one posh coffee, the entire collection could be yours for a whole month. There's even a free trial to test your stamina. The link to our News of the Times historical crime Patreon site awaits below in the description. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, part-time hedge trimming inspector, honorary lamplighter of dubious competence, and occasional custard spillage correspondent. Can the last one out? Please do persuade the neighbour's ferret not to unionize.